Hello and welcome back. In today's video, we are going to talk about 5 myths about being on a gluten-free diet. There's a lot of misinformation surrounding a gluten-free diet. So just a refresher, gluten is a protein found in wheat, rye, barley, malt, and some oats, depending on how they are processed. Oats are kind of a wild card, and that may depend on your particular situation. So myth number 1 is that a gluten-free diet is just a trend. And while it may have received a lot of attention in Hollywood over the recent years and have become a trend, it is not just a fad diet. For many individuals like myself and many others with celiac disease, it is in fact a medical condition. For people like myself where it is a medical condition, what happens is, the simple version is what happens is the protein in gluten attacks the villi, which is little finger-like projections in your gut. And what happens is the protein in the gluten essentially attacks those and causes a type of autoimmune inflammatory reaction and can cause some really severe gastrointestinal symptoms in those people. So I will say that the gluten-free becoming a trend has been a double-edged sword for those of us in the gluten-free community who need and have requested more gluten-free options for years. However, it can also cause a lot of problems when we try to eat out. I will never forget one of the first times I went to an Italian restaurant that had recently started offering a supposedly exclusively gluten-free menu. Of course, I've always asked a lot of questions of the servers. I've asked to talk to chefs, and they're generally very understanding. I'd asked the server what the gluten-free pasta was made with, and it was a rice pasta, and I read all the ingredients and everything looked safe. And so I went ahead and ordered it, and I think it really was just, I think it was probably just like a plain pasta, maybe a spaghetti or linguine in the lemon garlic butter sauce. So lemon, gluten-free, garlic, gluten-free, butter, gluten-free, these were the only ingredients, so great, everything was perfect. So I went ahead and ordered this meal, and then it came out, and it had a piece of regular Italian bread on the top. And the server didn't understand why I couldn't eat my meal. So for those of us where eating gluten-free really is a medical necessity, we can't eat that because the crumbs, particularly from a crumbly bread like an Italian bread, are now all in our meal and have essentially cross-contaminated this what was gluten-free meal now into a glutinous meal, and if we eat that, we could get sick. So the second myth about a gluten-free diet is that it is a healthier way to eat, and that if I eat gluten-free, I will lose weight. And that is also not exactly true. It can be, but it really, like many other things in health, depends. So if you are currently eating a glutinous diet, by eliminating the items that contain gluten, the things you are likely eliminating are things like breads, cookies, pastas, pretzels, maybe some chips. So a lot of highly processed foods that aren't particularly nutrient dense. If you are going to replace those items with gluten-free cookies or gluten-free pretzels, it's no healthier for you. And in fact, if you actually look at the nutrition label on those, a lot of those are more calorie dense and have higher sugars. So it is not going to necessarily help you lose weight, particularly if you are not eating gluten-free for any sort of medical reasons. Now, if you are going to eat a naturally gluten-free diet, which is going to be meats, vegetables, and fruits, then yeah, you may lose a little weight, but don't we all lose weight when we eat things like meats, vegetables, and fruits? So that's not necessarily a gluten-free correlation, that's just a making better choices situation. All right, and that leads us right into my third myth, which is that a product must be labeled gluten-free in order to be safe to eat for somebody who is gluten-free. And that could not be further from the truth. There are so many foods out there that don't contain gluten. So when we first talk about that, it sounds like, oh my goodness, gluten's in everything. Well, let's break it down, because really it's really not. So wheat is our biggie. That is going to be essentially, in layman's terms, in the simplest form, wheat is basically flour. So we're eliminating most breads, we're eliminating cakes, pancakes, rolls, but there are, of course, a ton of foods that are just that naturally don't contain gluten, right? I only mentioned 5 or 6 things. And when you're getting started, it can seem really overwhelming. But vegetables, right? Vegetables are grown in the ground. Vegetables don't contain gluten. Fruits don't contain gluten. It's a story time. So if I go to the grocery store, and this really has happened to me, and I walk in down the produce aisle and I see a bag of conventional grapes and they're $2.29 a pound. Great. Got green grapes, $2.29 a pound. And then right next to them are grapes in a bag with a big, bold, flashy gluten-free label on it. I might get charged $3.39 a pound. Same grapes, both grapes are gluten-free, but the one with the gluten-free label is more expensive. There's actually not a labeling requirement in the United States at the time of filming for a food to be labeled gluten-free. Now, there is a certification body, and I will link to them down below. And if you look at this little symbol right here, this GF with the circle around it was the old symbol, and they've recently updated their guidelines for stricter measures. So this is the new logo. So if you see one of these, then the food has gone through a strict gluten-free testing process, but pretty much any food that contains less than 20 parts per billion of gluten can be labeled as gluten-free, even if the food never contained any gluten in the first place. As I was saying, a lot of foods don't actually need that label. For a great example, and my husband actually suggested I include this at our wedding. Of course, I'm gluten-free, and we were going to have a small handful of guests who are also gluten-free. And so rather than trying to serve a number of imitation gluten-free products, we tried to make our menu as just naturally gluten-free as possible so that we didn't have to worry about the safety of myself and our guests. And we were able to do so. So at our wedding, we served a steak option, a sea bass option, and a chicken option. And we made sure that those were all naturally gluten-free items. Our vegetable sides were gluten-free. And so none of our guests had to worry about getting sick. Dessert was a bit of a different story. I'm probably one of the very few brides who did not get to try any of their own wedding cake. I'm gonna put a picture of that gorgeous cake in right here for you guys because it was just so pretty. My husband says it was really good. I got to design it and then he got to pick the flavors. All right, and then myth number 4 is that it is super expensive to eat gluten-free. And this, just like our other myths, this is another one that, depending on how you do it, yeah, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. So you guys who have been following me for a while, you know that I love Aldi, and I actually got turned on to the store specifically because of their gluten-free selection. Their Live G-Free brand is really good, and since having my daughter who has a dairy allergy, I have since learned that a lot of their products are also dairy-free, and this line has been really helpful for my family. So like I had said before, if I'm buying items that are naturally gluten-free, then I'm buying the same chicken or steak that you are. However, if I want something like a bagel or pretzels, then I do need to look for something that is a little bit more specialty and a little bit more specific, because obviously pretzels contain flour, bagels contain flour, bread, wraps, etc. So I did a comparison once, and if you want to see that comparison of gluten-free items, go ahead and click into this video right here, and there's a link to that in the description as well, comparing some of all these gluten-free specialty items to some of our local grocery stores. And what I learned was I was right for the most part that shopping at a budget-friendly grocer like Aldi really does help save a lot of money on these allergy-friendly items. For instance, a pack of gluten-free bagels at Giant is almost $9 right now. And at Aldi, that same pack of bagels, which I actually think tastes better, is $4.29, and that's a huge difference. The other thing with the budget items at Aldi is they do rotate, so I always get to try new things. Our 5th and final myth about being gluten-free is that it is impossible to read labels and figure out if something is in fact gluten-free. This did used to be true. I remember when I first started reading labels, it was really, really hard. And if you are new to this, it's overwhelming, no doubt. It is absolutely overwhelming, no doubt. But don't let the overwhelm stop you, and don't let the fear stop you from reading the labels, particularly if you or a friend or a loved one does need to eat gluten-free. So number 1, wheat, rye, barley, malt, and oats. As I mentioned before, oats are the wild card. Some celiacs can tolerate oats processed with wheat and some can't. And this may change for you depending on how long you have been eating gluten-free. Years ago, allergy labeling on food was not as good or as prominent as it is now. The vast majority of food manufacturers now in the United States do require top 8 allergen labeling. So the first thing that you want to do if you are new to label reading is scan really, really quickly and then look down the bottom for what is labeled in bold, and it will say contains in bold. And if it contains gluten or one of the other top 8 allergens, that should be right there. So for instance, here is a box of my daughter's animal crackers. So when I'm looking for me, I'm looking for gluten. When I'm looking for her, I'm looking for milk. But here's just an example for us since we're eating gluten-free. So we look at our ingredients and we can see right there, the bold. So this contains wheat and soy, right? So right away, even without reading all those ingredients, I can see that it contains wheat and that it is not safe for me to eat. If you want to learn a little bit more about being gluten-free, I've got some links down in the description below that you can check out. If you are new to eating gluten-free and you want to check out some easy, budget-friendly gluten-free recipes, go ahead and click into this playlist right here, and I will see you in the next video.